precisely because the United States supports it. That's what blocks any possible termination of that genocidal attack. There's one right in front of our eyes for which we're directly responsible, and there's virtually no awareness of it. I doubt if one person in 100 in the United States ever even heard of Timor. East Timor was a former Portuguese colony. DB. Why is that? Does it serve some ideological interest that there's no information? Sure. It's improper for people in the United States to know that their own government is involved in a genocidal massacre which is quite comparable to Pol Pot. Therefore they better not know about it, and they don't. This is particularly striking because it began, as you say, in 1975. Just at the time that the Pol Pot massacres began. They're rather comparable in many ways, except that the Timor-Leste massacre was carried out by an invading army rather than being a peasant revolution taking revenge and controlled by a gang of fanatics who were carrying out huge massacres in their own society. These two are rather comparable in scale, relative to the population. In fact, the Timor-Leste massacre is maybe 2 or 3 times as great. Once all the propaganda is filtered away, look. Language in the service of propaganda. 17. At the actual facts, the treatment of them was quite different. The Pol Pot massacres received enormous attention, tremendous protest, and was compared to the Nazis. The Timor-Leste massacre that we were responsible for was suppressed. People went way out of the way to try to find Cambodian refugees on the Thai-Cambodian border so that they could tell horror stories. They didn't go to Lisbon, which is much easier to reach than the Thai-Cambodian border, to talk to Timor-Leste refugees who would tell them what the United States was backing in Timbuktu. That whole near-genocidal attack, the term is not exaggerated in this case, was almost entirely suppressed for over 4 years. Even today, it's barely discussed, and when it is discussed, the American role is suppressed. For example, the New York Times finally began to talk about it and ran editorials. One was called The Shaming of Indonesia. Sure, it's the shaming of Indonesia, but it's also the shaming of the United States. We're the ones who blocked every diplomatic effort to stop it. The Carter administration, which was supposedly committed to human rights, vastly increased the flow of arms to Indonesia with a certain knowledge that they were going to be used to extend the massacre in East Timor. There was nothing else that they could be used for. None of this is the shaming of the United States, nor is it the shaming of the New York Times that they didn't report it for 4 years, and even today aren't reporting what's going on. These are again ways of protecting ourselves from understanding of the world. The population has to be protected from any understanding of that. That's one of the main purposes of the indoctrination system, to prevent the population from understanding what they are participating in indirectly through the institutions that they support. DB, and one sees, for example, in the case of the N1 massacre and ongoing killings in East Timor, a certain sense of bipartisan. 18. Chronicles of Dissent. Check. It started under the Ford administration in 1975. It continued during the Carter years. It escalated during the Carter years. The worst period was Carter, and it's still continuing now. Last year, there was another major Indonesian offensive. Once again, the Red Cross has been withdrawn, so there's virtually no international observation. About the only information we're getting is from refugees and the Catholic Church. The Church has been reporting these atrocities, but that virtually never reaches an American audience. We should ask ourselves, why are our institutions so concerned to prevent us from knowing what we're doing? I think the people in power are simply afraid of the population. If the general population has any awareness and understanding of what the state is up to, they'll protest and they'll stop it. That's why we have the same extremely elaborate and very effective systems of thought control. Why don't they just tell us the truth? They don't tell us the truth because they're afraid of us. They're afraid that if we know we're going to stop them, hence the lies, hence the educational system, hence the media, and so on. DB, let's talk about what I reluctantly call censorship. Perhaps you can find a better word for it here in the United States. Earlier I mentioned the 2-volume set that you have co-authored with Edward Herman, their Washington connection and After the Cataclysm. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but I believe that neither of those books received any prominent media coverage or book reviews, and now you have a new book with the title The Fateful Triangle, which has only received 2 reviews. One can draw 2 conclusions. Either the books are indeed terrible and not worth writing about, or perhaps a more cynical point of view would be that there's some kind of censorship being exercised here. As to whether they're worth writing about, obviously I think so, or I wouldn't have written them. We can make language in the service of propaganda. 19. A kind of objective test of that. For example, we can ask how the same books are received in other societies similar to ours. Take, say, Canada. Canada is a country very similar to the United States and has essentially the same values, institutions, social organizations, etc. kind of like an adjunct to the United States. But as soon as we cross the border, we find that the treatment of these books and their authors is radically different than it is here. For example, The Fateful Triangle, which came out about a year ago, is primarily concerned with American policy. It's peripheral to the interests of Canadians, but central to the interests of Americans. It was barely mentioned in the press here, and is very hard to find. You have to really work to dig it out somewhere. It's probably not in the libraries. But in Canada, it was reviewed in major journals and most minor journals, even in the Financial Post, which is sort of like the Wall Street Journal. It was reviewed in the news weeklies, the equivalent of to me a Newsweek. Every time I go to Canada, I'm immediately on radio and television. I was there last week for a day, and I had 3 interviews on national CBC in the United States. People with similar views, not just me, are marginalized, excluded. No reviews. You rarely find such books in the libraries. The media are almost totally closed off. If we look at other countries similar to the United States, the same is true in England and Australia. Again, countries very much like us. These books are reviewed, discussed, etc. not in the United States. However, if the judgment is one of quality, then it's striking that the judgment is so different across the border. Incidentally, many of the reviews are quite critical, but that's fair enough. People say what they think. DB, could you speculate why? For example, you're not an occasionally Dan Rather's CBS Evening News or National Public Radio S. All things considered, has known one CLWN, one Skybin and one marginalized, to use the term that you've coined. 20. Chronicles of Dissent. That's always been the case. For example, during the Vietnam War, when I was very visible in opposition to the war on the international scene, and here too, I live in Boston, and I was constantly in the radio and television studios here. But for foreign interviews, I think I was once on public radio in the Boston area during the Vietnam War. I had just returned from a trip to Indochina, and I was on for about 5 minutes. But I was constantly on Australian, Canadian, British, continental European radio and the television. That's consistently the case. Just in the last 2 weeks I've been on national Italian television, on Canadian television, on Irish radio, all over the place. In another couple of weeks I'm going to England for a day for a big television program discussing politics. In the United States, it's virtually unknown. In fact, it's very striking that I'm now talking over a Colorado radio station. When you get out of the main centers in the United States, out of New York, Boston and Washington, then the controls ease. If I go to Denver or Boulder or Des Moines or Minneapolis or San Diego, then it's not at all unlikely that 111 be asked to talk on political topics on radio and sometimes television. But in the main ideological centers it's unimaginable. Again, that's not just me, but also other people who are essentially dissenting critics. This reflects the sophistication of our ideological system. What happens in areas that are marginal with respect to the exercise of power doesn't matter so much. What happens in the centers of power matters a great deal. Therefore the controls are tighter as you get closer to the center. As soon as you cross the border to Canada, nobody really cares much what happens, so therefore it is much freer. DB. So essentially if, as you did last year, you come to Boulder and give many public lectures and appear on KGNU and now doing a phone interview on KGNU, that's okay since we're out here in the boondocks, as it were. Language in the service of propaganda. 21. It's not totally okay, but it's better. It could never happen on National Public Radio. On March 30th, verse 988, Noam Chomsky was interviewed for the first time on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. DB. One final question about George Orwell. I sensed from your writing and from some oft comments you've made in this interview that you feel a certain kinship with Orwell. Have you been influenced by him at all? It's a little complicated. I think Orwell wrote one really great book which did influence me a lot. That was Homage to Catalonia, the book that he wrote about his experiences during the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. The history of that book is itself interesting and revealing. It appeared in 1937 but was not published in the United States. It was published in England, and it sold a couple hundred copies. The reason that the book was suppressed was because it was critical of communists. That was a period when pro-communist intellectuals had a great deal of power in the intellectual establishment. It's similar to the kind of control that many people called pro-Israel, although I think it's a bad term, that people who are called pro-Israel have over media and expressed sign today. They're similar in many respects. They succeeded in preventing Orwell's book from appearing. It did appear about 10 years later, and it appeared as a Cold War tract because it was anti-Russian and fashions had changed. That was a really important book. I think there were things wrong with it, but it was a book of real great significance and importance. It's probably the least known of Orwell's major political books. His better known books, in my view, are not very significant. For example, 1984, which is very popular here. In fact, it's a major bestseller, because it can be easily construed as anti-Russian propaganda. But it's a very shallow book, basically. Orwell was giving a satirical analysis based upon 22. Chronicles of Dissent. Existing Soviet society. Existing Soviet society and its theater have been very well described by factual analyses, not very well known here, but they existed. People like Maximov, for example, the anarchist historian, had given excellent detailed analyses of Leninist and Stalinist institutionalized terror going back to the revolution. You didn't have to go to Orwell and Chomsky to find this out. Orwell's fictionalized account was, in my view, no major contribution and also not very well done. We also tend to suppress some of the aspects of it. He was also talking about England, not just Russia. He was talking about what he expected to happen in the industrial democracies, and as a prediction that was very bad, that hasn't happened. I also think he missed the main techniques of thought control and indoctrination in the democracies. For example, in England and the United States, we do not use the devices for control he described. Brute vicious use of highly visible power. That's not the way thought control works here. It works by more subtle and much more effective devices, the kinds we've been talking about. Orwell completely missed this. On the other hand, he was an honest man. He did try to, and often succeeded, in extricating himself from the systems of thought control, and in that respect he was very unusual and very praiseworthy. D.B. Bernard Crick, a British biographer of Orwell, seems to corroborate what you say. He suggests that it is in the essays where the dirty work of imperialism is illuminated, such as a hanging and shooting an elephant, that Orwell would be best remembered in the earlier mentioned politics and the English language. I agree with that. The famous works are the least significant. Israel, the Strategic Set. March 23rd, verse 985. D.B. One of the most interesting aspects of the relationship between the United States and Israel is that in this country there is virtually unanimous agreement on U.S. support for Israeli policies. To cite one example, in the March 4, 1985 New York Times, Senator Daniel Inouye said, he doesn't understand why administration after administration, Republican and Democrat, puts the squeeze on Israel. I am convinced that it is in our best national interest to make sure a strong, viable Israel continues to exert its influence in that part of the world. He continues, in asking for more aid for Israel, that we have received more than our money's worth. I'd like you to discuss some of the factual and moral premises inherent in Inouye's comments about Israel and that it is in our best national interest. I'd also like to comment about how we put their squeeze on Israel. Since 1978 they've gotten something ranging between a third to a half of total American military and economic aid in the world. That's a country of 4 million people. So the concept of the squeeze is interesting. NG. I think it's clear what a new eye means, and there's some logic to it. Israel has served certain kinds of American interests, and the aid to Israel is closely correlated with the American conception of how they can serve American interests. What the United States wants from Israel is that it become a technologically advanced, highly militarized society without any independent or viable economy of its own, so that it's totally dependent on the United States and therefore dependable. We maintain it in a position. Our policy is designed to create a system of a dependence with a capacity for organized violence, so that 24 Chronicles of Dissent. We can use it as what we call a strategic asset, which means a kind of an attack dog. It's what was called under the Nixon doctrine a guardian of the Gulf, namely, a force which can be used either as a base for projection of American military force or its own military force in the case of any conceived threat to quite narrowly perceived American interests in the region. The main interest is to ensure that there's no development of what we call radical nationalism. Radical nationalism is a technical term meaning nationalist forces that don't obey American orders. It's counterpart to moderate nationalism, which means nationalism that does follow American order. The major American interest in the region is of course not Israel, but the energy resources which, it's been known for 40 or 50 years, are the largest and cheapest in the world. We want to make sure that there's no indigenous threat to our domination of that system. In the early years we assumed that our own power could achieve that result. But increasingly over the years, as the world has become more complex and the American capacity to intervene directly has reduced, the United States has turned to circular aids. This became more or less formalized in the Nixon-Kissinger doctrine, which quite explicitly explained that while the United States would be committed to maintaining what Kissinger called the overall framework of order, regional powers would pursue particular goals within this system. That meant it was a matter of designating the local cop on the beat to control the neighborhood, while police headquarters remains in Washington. That's in effect the Nixon-Kissinger doctrine. With regard to the extremely crucial Middle East region, primarily the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula, where most of the oil is, The conception was that Israel and Iran under the Shah would be what was then called guardians of the Gulf. That's the primary basis for this. Israel, the strategic asset. 25. Enormous military support, which has the predictable consequence of turning Israel into a kind of Sparta, essentially eliminating its status as a Bible society other than as a military force designed to serve American interests in the region. Correspondingly, Israel is also expected to provide subsidiary services. That's part of the quid pro quo. This began in the 1960s as Israel began to be framed in the American geopolitical conception as a strategic asset. In the 1960s, under a large CIA subsidy, Israel penetrated Black Africa in the interests of American power. They were, for example, the main force that succeeded in establishing the Mobutu dictatorship in Zaire. They supported Idi Amin in Uganda in the early days, Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, Emperor Bokassa in the Central African Republic, and various others who the United States was trying to cultivate and use for its Latin Americanization of Africa. The establishment of a dependable client regimes, generally military-based, would be as sure to control the local societies. Increasingly, these secondary services have moved elsewhere, however, primarily Latin America. During the 1970s, under popular pressure, Congress legislated human rights constraints which restricted the American executive in its attempts to support the worst murderers and monsters in Latin America. Therefore, they had to move under the Carter administration, and since under the Reagan administration, to do it indirectly using surrogates. Israel was able to establish close relations with the neo-Nazi regimes in the Southern Cone, Argentina and Chile. That's in the American interests, since the United States had to sidestep direct support for them. In Central America, the United States relied primarily on Argentine Nazis, but increasingly, and by now primarily, on Israeli forces to support genocidal attacks on the Indian population in Guatemala or to send arms to El Salvador and Honduras to support the Contras are two examples. 26. Chronicles of Dissent. This is a long and very ugly story, and that's a secondary aspect to the services that Israel is expected to provide for us. All of this is in the public record. If we speculate about what's in the secret record, the United States has major conventional military forces aimed at the Persian Gulf. It's called the Central Command. It used to be called the Rapid Deployment Force. If any unwanted nationalist developments take place in that region, we'll invade. But we need a basing system for that. And we have by now a very elaborate basing system stretching from Turkey all the way around the region to the Indian Ocean. Though there is no public document on this, it's a fair guess, a near certainty, that Israel is regarded as a central part of that basing system. Much of what I have just said is not only obvious from the way history has evolved, but it's expressed in the declassified record. For example, you can see how the American relation to Israel has changed over the years. In the early 1950s, it was rather cool and conflicted. In 1956, we ordered Israel out of the Sinai after it had attacked Egypt. The reason being that it had attacked Egypt jointly with France and England. We were then referring to France and England as essentially our enemies. They were attempting to reassert a position from which we had expelled them because we wanted to control that region ourselves. Israel, in its attack on Egypt jointly with them, was essentially conspiring with the enemy, so we threw them out. In the early 1950s, at least, it wasn't clear who the United States was going to use as the basis for its regional power. There was some support for using NASA's Egypt for this purpose. NASA had some CIA backing at the time and other support. By the mid-1950s, it became pretty clear that NASA was going to be a radical nationalist. That is, he wasn't going to follow American orders. and Nasserite influence began to spread throughout the region. By 1958, a National Security Council memorandum, Israel, the Strategic Casa 27, on the Middle East, concluded that a logical corollary to our opposition to radical Arab nationalism would be support for Israel as the only reliable pro-Western force in the region. Through the 1960s, this increased. American intelligence regarded Israel as a barrier to nationalist Nasserite pressure in the Arabian Peninsula, and there was a kind of proxy war going on in the southern part of the peninsula between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Israel was regarded as a shield protecting the monarchies which controlled the oil, very much subordinated to the United States. Israel's 1967 victory, which really showed that it was the overwhelmingly dominant military force in the region, confirmed its value as a strategic asset. The United States certainly supported Israel in that attack and may actually have participated in it. There's evidence to that effect. It certainly supported it. At that point, American aid to Israel increased enormously, and it seemed like Senator I and others recognized that this could be a valuable military force. In 1970, American aid to Israel quadrupled after Israel had succeeded in doing something that we desperately needed at that time. There was concern that Syria might intervene in Jordan to protect Palestinians who were being massacred by the Jordanian army. The United States was very much concerned about that and regarded it as a potential threat to the oil-producing region. Israel was able to use its overwhelming military force to block any possible Syrian support for the Palestinians, and American aid shot up. It was at that point that the Nixon Doctrine was explicitly formulated, and Israel's role was more or less formalized regarding the Gulf. When the Shah fell in 1979, Iran lost that role plainly, and Israel was left the sole reliable militarized base for the United States. Aid to Israel again shot up enormously. At that time, we also carried through what is called here the peace process, which is kind of an Orwellian 20 Chronicles of Dissent term, referring to the fact that we instituted a system whereby Egypt was totally excluded from the conflict through the Camp David Agreement. The intent and consequences of that policy were to leave Israel free to extend and intensify its occupation of the occupied territories, and also to attack its northern neighbour without any concern for a deterrent force. That's exactly what happened from 1978. The first invasion of Lebanon was in 1978. The repression and expansion of settlements in the occupied territories increased rapidly. Israel continued to attack Lebanon, and in 1982 it invaded directly, and we know the consequences since. All of this flowed quite predictably and directly from the Camp David peace process. That again is part of the whole system of turning Israel into a militarized state. By now, it's probably the most militarized society in the world. It has probably the highest per capita debt in the world. Its status as the economic entity, for example, is reflected in its credit ratings with international banks, which are below that of Mozambique or Bangladesh. And that's even with the huge American subsidies. Increasingly, it's undergoing the kind of continual changes, cultural changes, and others, which follow from this debt. This is related to the reason why the United States has consistently blocked any possibility of a diplomatic settlement. There have been many possibilities, at least since 197-1, for a peaceful political settlement. The United States has consistently blocked all of them because they would require that Israel be a peaceful member of a region in which relations are conducted by diplomacy rather than violence, and we won't accept that. That won't be the role that we want Israel to play. Virtually all of this has been very easily documented. I've written about it. There's plenty of material, but it's almost totally suppressed and distorted in the official versions. We talk about the peace process and Israel's search for peace, etc. That's the real story. How much?
Ooh.
Israel, the
Holy
strategic
man,
asset.
see, this is the thing
29.
too. You can take them down.
Senator, I actually understand
they're like,
of
"You're
what
crazy,
he's
I'm gonna
saying.
kill you,"
I
know,
don't know.
because you're like a
But the
little
people
indie or
who
whatever
do
like
the
that.
actual
And they're
planning
like,
surely understand this, and it's
then
this evolving conception of Israel's
they pay
strategic
attention to
role
it
in the
for a
region
second,
which
and they
accounts
take you
for its
out.
enormous and rather special
all of a sudden,
kind of subsidy
everybody's
that
standing
we
around
provide.
killing you.
One that's
And
guaranteed
when
to
you see your
maintain
killer
it as a
is,
military
it's like your
force
killer
and to
is
maintain a
molten slag.
situation of military confrontation in the region, which is part of this whole
Everybody
thing.
a fake?
Easy. Indeed, the Camp David process has kind of altered the popular mythology.
I would
It
love-
has a Nobel Peace Prize mystique about it, and we celebrate it
Man,
as
I
a
only got
model,
4
as the
ways
proper
that way.
vehicle through settlement of the Arab-Israeli dispute. Senator John Kerry in Denver on March
I'm
16, 1985,
I'm
said
listening to a
that
bug
he
reading a
favors a
chat.
return to the Camp David process.
Playing
Why
free-for-all
is
deathmatch.
Camp David so firmly
Watching
established
about
as the model?
15 Gamma
That's
movies
an
all at
indication
once.
of the marvelous effectiveness
The most intense
of the
scenes.
American indoctrination system. Let's recall
No,
that
20.
Camp David was an agreement
There are
whereby
20
Israel
of
left the
different movie
Sinai and
clips
foreign
playing.
forces, including American, were placed in the Sinai to ensure that that's not an area of military confrontation. That, in effect, excluded Egypt from the conflict. That's the only thing that was done in Camp David, to exclude the major Arab military force from their conflict. Its exclusion, which they themselves wanted, means that there is no deterrent to Israel's doing whatever it wants. What it felt like doing
I'll
was
tell you what,
obvious,
I
moving
would get
towards
something
tallying over and
on your
integrating the
recommendation.
occupied
Can you
tenure.
give me a recommendation
Tories
now?
and harassing
If
the
my
northern
wife
border,
will buy it.
expanding towards the north. It has continued to do that
'Cause I'm
until it
serious,
suffered
she
its
lost her,
first military
business
defeat
so
in the
bad.
last couple
Yeah,
of
she
months
gets really
at the
pissed
hands
off.
of the Lebanese
But
resistance. Up
Angela,
until that
she,
point it was just regular expansion
my sister's
towards the
business,
north. In order to ensure that they would do this
Thank you.
effectively,
My sister
we
got sick
massively
and died.
increased
Pretty
military aid to Israel at the same time,
And, revenue from that business,
1,978,
at a minimum
79.
right now is
As
closer to
already mentioned,
$10
the
lost.
fall of the Shah was a side element in this that left Israel the sole reliable.
We're
30.
much worse
Chronicles
off.
of Dissent. Guardian of the Gulf. The peace process entailed American aid reaching enormous proportions. In 1979, it was something like 50% of total American aid overseas. What was in Jimmy Carter's mind I have no idea, but it was obvious to any rational person that if you free Israel from any deterrent force by eliminating the only substantial Arab military force in the region, and if you then provide it with enormous subsidies, then it will attack as it has done. The subsidies, incidentally, are unspecified. In the case of every other aid program in the world, it's project-oriented. We require specific indications of what the aid is going to be used for. Usually, it has to be used with glitches of American export or something like that. In any case, it's closely supervised. For example, in
love
Egypt,
a free
which is
for
the
all,
next
man.
largest aid recipient, we have something like 125 technicians supervising the aid down to the last detail and making sure it's used for exactly the project we want it used for. Israel is unique. The aid, which is unbelievably high on a per capita basis of chart, also happens to be unsupervised. It's just a cash grant. We're telling them, do whatever you like with it. That's a not too subtle way of telling them, use it for settlement of the occupied territory, use it for military attacks against Lebanon, etc. That was perfectly predictable, and furthermore, it's exactly what happened. Even people who couldn't see it at the time can look back now and see that that's what happened. The expansion into the occupied territory, which had been going on for 10 years at that point, then increased very rapidly. Also, the repression in the occupied territories increased. The military occupation, which had always been harsh, became much more brutal, especially in 198, 1 and 1982. And Israel attacked Lebanon. It invaded Lebanon in 1978. To 1979, there was heavy bombardment against Lebanon with hundreds, maybe thousands of people killed. Israel repeatedly broke ceasefires to initiate attacks.
Here he comes again. Let's see.
Israel, the strategic asset.
Yeah.
31. Against Lebanon. In July 1981, in one important case, Israeli planes broke a ceasefire, attacked Lebanon. There was at that point a light rocket response, at which time Israel stepped up to attack and bombed Beirut, killing several hundred people. After that there was a heavier rocket response against the northern Galilee, and even heavier Israeli bombings. These were finally stopped by an American-imposed ceasefire in late July. At the time it was stopped, about 450 Arabs and 6 Israelis had been killed, which are normal proportions reflecting the power balance. The only thing that's remembered from all that today is that rockets were fired at northern Galilee. That's in the news reports. That's always cited now as a justification for Israel's attack on Lebanon. Yes, rockets were fired on northern Galilee in response to heavy Israeli bombing which killed hundreds of civilians. After this point, the PLO did adhere to the ceasefire scrupulously. There were no attacks across the Lebanese border for 11 months or so. Israel, on the other hand, attempted throughout that period 198, 1-82, to elicit some kind of PLO action which could be used as an alleged provocation, a pretext for the further attack on Lebanon, which they began planning in July 198. Again, this was completely predictable. The American press either couldn't or pretended not to be able to see it, but it was obvious at the time. Throughout 198, 1 and 1982 there were repeated Israeli provocations, including bombing of Lebanese towns, to elicit some kind of action, maybe shelling of the north or something, which could then be used as a pretext for the invasion that they had been planning. When no pretext could be found, they simply concocted one and invaded in June 1982. They had full American support, incidentally. That was the Lebanese War. After that they attempted to consolidate their position in southern Lebanon and would have done so had it. 32. Chronicles of Dissent. Not being from the resistance in the south. Here this resistance is called terrorism. All of that comes out of the Camp David peace process. It's interesting that these elementary facts can't be perceived by a propaganda system. It parallels the Soviet Union, I suppose, in that the propaganda system pretends or just can't see that the Soviet Union is engaged in severe repression in Eastern Europe and an invasion of Afghanistan. They just can't see it, or at least can't say it. Comparably, we don't see or can't say these things here. I should mention that one might ask, or any reporter who's even moderately serious would ask, what is the attitude of the indigenous population in the occupied territories? We know that. For example, there are Israeli-run polls concerning the Camp David peace process. It turns out that the population overwhelmingly, over 90%, regards the Camp David peace process as detrimental to their interests. It's obvious why, for the reasons discussed previously. A final comment about Camp David is that on their part of this peace process there has been a consistent attempt, which the United States has blocked, on the part of the Arab states and the Europeans to initiate a real peace process. That began clearly in February 197-1, when President Sadat of Egypt offered Israel a full peace settlement. In his proposal, there was nothing offered to the Palestinians at all. They were simply ignored. The full peace settlement was to be on the internationally recognized borders, the pre-1967 borders, with recognized borders, guaranteed security, etc. Israel refused it because they wanted to take over the territory. This was the Dovish Labour government at the time. The United States backed them in that refusal. That's remained constant until today. For example, just about a year ago Arafat offered Israel negotiations leading to mutual recognition. Of course, Israel immediately rejected it. The United States didn't even bother to respond. Israel, the strategic asset. 33. This was virtually blacked out of the American media. Today, it's as if it didn't exist. In between that period are numerous similar cases where the United States has vetoed peace offers at the UN. That came from Syria, Jordan, Egypt and the PLO, who called for a two-state settlement. Everyone recognizes this is the only peaceful settlement, which guaranteed recognized borders, etc. Repeatedly over the years, the United States has refused to accept any genuine peace offer. So there is something that we might call the peace process, except that it's been aborted by the United States, and of course rejected by Israel consistently. It's out of history, it just doesn't exist. For example, when the New York Times runs a news story reporting on the history of peace efforts, as it did a couple of days ago by Thomas Friedman, their reporter in Jerusalem, none of this is mentioned. It's just down the memory hole. The only thing that exists is the American-run system, the Camp David system, which we call the peace process, which in fact is just a war process. DB, you've said that the United States and Israel have stood in the way of an international settlement, basically on racist grounds. Although they accept the right of Israel to be a national state, primarily for Jews, they do not accept that the indigenous population has a parallel right. Why? I think the American position is strictly racist. There's no question about it. There are two national groups which claim the right of national self-determination in what is once Palestine. There is an indigenous population, the Palestinians, and there are the settlers who partially replaced them, namely the Jewish immigrants. We accept without any question the right of the Jewish immigrants to national self-determination in Palestine, and therefore we unequivocally support Israel as an expression of that national right. However, we deny a comparable right to the indirect death. 34. Chronicles of Dissent. New population. Our current position, for example, is that we will only agree even to talk to Palestinians, the indigenous population, if they're not associated with the PLO. The PLO is plainly the organization which they recognize as the expression of their national rights. There's no doubt about this. Returning to these Israeli-run polls, something like 98% of the population in the occupied territories calls for an independent Palestinian state. That's what they want. Something like 86% of them in the latest Israeli-run poll want it to be run solely by the PLO. The rest want to see it run largely by the PLO. The same is true in Palestinian diaspora. That's more support than the Zionist organization had among Jews in the 1940s. If in the 1940s the United States government had said, yes, we'll be willing to talk to Jews about Palestine, but only if they're not connected with the Zionist organization, and of course not permitting any Jewish state, that would have been regarded as racist, and correctly. I should say that the Jewish world was divided over this issue. To refuse to talk to the PLO today is to take the same stand. Again, it's kind of remarkable that American commentary cannot perceive the extraordinary racism of this position. This racism shows up elsewhere as well. Take the way in which we react to what's happening today in southern Lebanon. The American commentary regards it as quite legitimate for the Israeli occupying army to use violence to suppress resistance. In fact, here it's sometimes even called terror against terror, which is a term that's chilling. That's the name of an organization set up by the Gestapo to attack European resistance. We use it without any qualms to refer to what's going on in southern Lebanon, except we support it. Even when it reaches the point of Israel murdering CBS reporters, as happened a couple of days ago, the president gets on television and says, this is perfectly fine, they were used to doing it in self-defense, etc. There's no comment on this in Israel, the strategic asset. 35. The press as yet. Take the commentary on Israel's forced withdrawal from the south, which is being forced by local resistance. There are anguished stories in the media about the dramatic consequences for the people of northern Galilee. will once again be under rocket fire from Lebanon. The border was completely peaceful for a year before Israel attacked, and the rocket fire, as I mentioned, was in retaliation to Israeli bombing. Murder of Arabs is considered a perfectly legitimate occupation. Israel killed dozens, maybe hundreds of local people, Lebanese, in its so-called Iron Fist operations in the last months. This included real terrorist attacks like breaking into hospitals, taking people away who are trying to give blood to people wounded in Israeli attacks, beating up a hospital director, real barbarism. That's considered legitimate. It's the right to use military force in another country to suppress the local population. Another aspect of the same racism shows up quite dramatically in our diplomatic stance. Our refusal to recognize that the indigenous population has the rights that we naturally accord to the Jewish settlers who immigrated to the country. It's even reached the point that in the United States there's a pretense that the indigenous population didn't exist. There's a rather comical incident in the last year that involves a completely fraudulent book from time immemorial by Joan Peters, which became a bestseller in the United States. Virtually every review of it here was extremely laudatory. The book claims that the Palestinians didn't exist. It's a concoction of lies and distortions. As soon as the publishers made a tactical error and allowed it to appear in England, where the intelligentsia are not so totally controlled on this issue, it was immediately blasted out of the water. Every review pointed out grotesque errors and ridiculous fabrications. But here it was accepted as gospel truth because it says what we want to hear. If Palestinians didn't exist, that 36 Chronicles of Dissent justifies the racist attitudes towards them. B.B. June 1985 is the third anniversary of the Peace for Galilee, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. What has Israel accomplished in Lebanon? It accomplished quite a bit. The main purpose of Israel in Lebanon is revealed by their own statements. For example, Prime Minister Chomsky pointed out that Israel faced a real danger in Lebanon before 1982. He then went on to explain that it was not a military but a political danger, that the PLO had scrupulously adhered to the ceasefire and had increased its attempts to lay the basis for a political settlement. That's a danger, because if there is to be a political settlement and the Palestinians are to be recognized as participants, then Israel will not be able to maintain its control over the occupied territories and will have to settle for peace and peaceful integration into the region, which it does not want to do. So there was a political danger, as Chomsky pointed out. One of the best Israeli journalists, a well-known Israeli satirist, B. Michal, had an article right after Chomsky's statement in which he stated, "Thank God there's no one to talk to." Israel did succeed in eliminating this political threat. The attack on the Palestinians, which meant the destruction of organized Palestinian society that was the purpose of the war, was successful. Organized Palestinian society was destroyed, the PLO was somewhat marginalized, and the danger of a political settlement reduced. Israel had further goals, namely to essentially take over Lebanon and install what they called a new order, which would mean a client regime based on right-wing Christians and selected privileged Muslim elites. This is sometimes called Sharon's plan, and now people denounce it because Sharon was so terrible. But it should be remembered when it looked as though that plan was going to be successful in late August 1982, after the Israel, the strategic asset. 37. Savage bombings of Beirut and the destruction of southern Lebanon. The popular support for it in Israel was enormous. Support began and Sharon reached about 80%, which was totally unprecedented in Israel. It was only when the plan began to fall apart that opposition developed. That was the large plan, namely the establishment of a client state based on those Christian and elected Muslim elements. That failed. They were unable to do that for a number of reasons. one of them being the intense resistance in the south. In fact, in the south, Israel has so far read its first military defeat ever. It has been compelled by local resistance to partially withdraw from southern Lebanon. I don't believe it really intends to withdraw. What they're intending to do is to hold onto as much of southern Lebanon as they can, and that will take violence, because the local population does resist. But they'll do that. There may be moves towards trying to depopulate southern Lebanon if that's necessary, as they did along the Jordan Valley in the late 1960s. They'll maintain a foothold there, I would imagine, at least if the United States supports them. DB, can you talk about the problems of discussing Israeli policies in the United States without being labeled anti-Semitic? You, for example, speak out frequently, and you've written many books. Have you personally encountered any difficulties? I can't be called anti-Semitic because I'm Jewish, so there's another label that's used. These are used by people who call themselves supporters of Israel. Actually, they are the real enemies of Israel. They're supporting the development of what I have described. The development of a militarized and viable society geared towards war and subservient to American interests. That's not support for Israel in any meaningful sense. People who call themselves supporters of Israel have two categories. 38. Chronicles of Dissent, with which they try to silence criticism. One is anti-Semite, the other is self-hating Jew. That takes care of everyone. You're either an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew if you don't follow the party line strictly. These tactics run across the board, so it's not just right-wing extremist Israeli circles or supporters of Israel here that adopt that position, but also people like Abba Ibn, a Labour dove, who have explicitly stated that the task of Israeli agitprop is to make it clear that any criticism of Israel is either anti-Semitism, the position of self-hating Jews. In the United States, a rather effective system of intimidation has been developed to silence screaming. Let me just give you one example. Take the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith, which is reputed to be a civil rights organization. It's rather comical. It's actually an organization devoted to trying to defame and intimidate and silence people who criticize current Israeli policies, whatever they may be. For example, I myself received, through a leak in the New England office of the Anti-Defamation League, a copy of my file there. It's 150 pages, just like an FBI file. Inter-office memos warning that I'm going to show up here and there. Surveillance of talks that I give, comments and alleged transcripts of talks. They're mostly fabricated because people don't hear or can't understand. This material has been circulated. If I'm going to give a talk somewhere, this material would be sent to some local group which would use it to extract defamatory material which would then be circulated, usually in unsigned pamphlets outside the place where I'd be speaking. I happened to get this material when it was being sent to Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz in preparation for a debate that we were to have a few days later, so that he would be able to extract from it defamatory material concocted by the Anti-Defamation League surveillance system, which is in fact exactly what he did. This is typical of the way they act. If there's any comment in Israel, the strategic asset. 39. The press, which they regard as insufficiently subservient to the PRT line, there'll be a flood of letters, delegations, protests, threats to withdraw advertising, etc. The politicians, of course, are directly subjected to this, and they are also subjected to substantial financial penalties if they don't go along. The Israeli press is very open about this. For example, after the last election, there was an article in one of the major Israeli journals by a very good journalist named Yov Karni. The headline of the article was actually a pun. It reads, in Hebrew, Jewish money buys the vote, but it could also be read as Jewish money buys everything. That was the headline. Then came a report of the speech by Thomas Stein, head of the Israeli lobbying group in Washington, AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, in which he just gloated over the successes of the Jewish political lobby, the Israeli political lobby here, in controlling the American congressional elections. He said that their major achievement was to eliminate Senator Charles Percy, who was too critical of Israel. He went on to say that they felt that, through electoral victories, they had Congress in their pocket until the year 2000. If this appeared somewhere in the United States, it would be regarded as some kind of fanatic, anti-Semitic publication, sort of like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. But this is a Hebrew article in the Hebrew press. I should mention that the journalist was appalled by all of this. He said it was a real threat to American democracy. But here the Israeli lobbying groups regard it as a great success, and they are quite proud of it, though, of course, they don't publicly say the things that they say privately. This is a very effective system, particularly since there's no counterweight to it. There's no pressure on the other side. There is a very broad international consensus, and there has been for many years, over a political settlement to the dispute. It's essentially a two-state settlement which would recognize the national rights of both Jews, 40 Chronicles of Dissent, and Palestinians. It's supported by most of the world. It's blocked by the United States, who leads the reductionist camp. But the point is that there's no articulate voice here expressing anything like the international consensus. There's no articulate voice here opposing repression and atrocities conducted quite freely by Israel, which encourages them to go on and do more of it. That's one of the reasons why they're capable of such really barbaric actions in South Lebanon. They've never been criticized in the past. Why should it begin now? There's occasional criticism when things really get out of hand, like the Sabra and Sheikla massacres, but that's quickly silenced and things return to their norm. THLS is a totally one-sided pressure and system of vilification, lying, defamation, and judicious use of funds in the political system that has created a highly biased approach to the whole matter and is why the United States can continue to block a political settlement. The system of military confrontation, a very dangerous one that repeatedly threatens global war, is maintained with complete impunity. There's no intern dot of criticism here. DB, not about genuine Israeli farce. You're quite familiar with the level of lexical violence from Arabs and others talking about Israel as 11 cancer in the Middle East that needs to be exterminated and L11 eliminated. First of all, I'm not familiar with those because they're mostly fabricated. They did exist, primarily in the 1960s, but since early 1970, most of the Arab world has been quite willing to reach an accommodation with Israel. This was explicit in the case of Egypt in 197-1, Jordan in 197-1 made a similar proposal. I don't want to bother going through the whole diplomatic record here, which I reviewed in the Fateful Triangle not too long ago. Through the 1970s there were repeated Arab offers, Egypt, Syria, the PLO, Saudi Arabia and others, to arrange for a politic Israel, the strategic asset. 41. Cal settlement in accord with the international consensus. There is talk about a cancer and so on, but that typically comes from Israeli sources. Israel typically refers to the PLO as a cancer which is metastasizing and a disease which has to be stamped out, etc. DB Gideon Hausner said that. Yes, who was the prosecutor in the Eichmann trial, the person who used this terminology which is in fact rather reminiscent of Eichmann himself. However, I wouldn't downplay the threat to Israel. I think it's real. As long as military confrontation persists, Israel is in real danger of destruction. There's no doubt about that. My own feeling is that they're heading for destruction. They happen to be the dominant military force in the region now, but there's no guarantee that that will persist. In a system of continued and unending military confrontation, sooner or later they're going to lose. Military intelligence is a very low credibility operation. It rarely knows what it's talking about. Modern history shows that quite well. They may think that they're in a position of military dominance, and they may find that they're wrong. Unexpected things do happen in the case of war. They came close to being destroyed in 1973 after 2 years of rejecting Sadat's peace offers. However, they have not learned the lesson from that. The lesson plainly is that if they want to maintain control of the occupied territories and they want to keep harassing the northern border, then they're going to be in a situation of permanent military confrontation. That's going to mean repeated chance of war and sooner or later destruction. So, the threats are very real, except that I think that by now a lot of these threats are self-generated. DB, a central thesis of your book, The Fateful Triangle, is that Antlewood, the United States claims to be the friend of Israel, the 42. Chronicles of Dissent. Policy it's pursuing will ultimately destroy it. I think that's true. I think it's even more dramatically true of the people who call themselves supporters of Israel. I should say that this view is shared very widely by the small group of Israeli doves. They put things in terms much more extreme and harsh than I would use. For example, take Meir Hale, who's a real member of the Israeli establishment. He's a retired colonel, a well-known military historian, formerly a leading military strategist in the army. He was head of the officers' training school in the Israeli army, straight out of the establishment. He had an article about a year ago in which he was attacking the American Jewish community. I think he was targeting Itunru. The title of the article was Zionism and the Danger of Cancer. He said that the danger was coming from the American Jewish community, that what they want is the Israel, which is a way I admit God is similar to Mars. They get their psychological thrills from seeing Israel, a Superman, stomping on people's faces. He went on to say that the attitude of the American Jewish community and their monolithic support for these tendencies in Israel and their intolerance of any discussion and debate of them are going to create an Israel which will be a new development in political history, a combination of the worst features of South Africa and Northern Ireland. He virtually pleaded with the American Jewish community to stop what they call support for Israel, which is, in fact, driving it in this direction. As I say, those are terms much more extreme than I would use, and they come from a mainstream Israeli establishment figure who happens to be a dove. I think he's much too narrowly focused when he talks about the American Jewish community. That's what they tend to see. In fact, the support for that kind of policy in the United States is only very partially based on the American Jewish community. It's far broader than that. Israel, the strategic asset. 43. DB. There seems to be much more pluralism and political diversity in Israel on some of these issues than in the United States itself. There's no doubt of that. For the Jewish population of Israel, let's put aside the Arab citizens, it achieves a level of democracy that's well beyond that of the United States. These issues, in particular, are commonly debated in Israel. In the United States, they're so marginalized as to be non-existent. Again, to take a personal case, I can virtually not publish in the United States on these topics, but I've been asked by mainstream Israeli journals to write regular articles for them. DB, you read Hebrew and you closely follow Israeli press and politics. Do you see any signs in Israel today that point toward a two-state settlement? There can be no signs in Israel for a very asymptotical reason. Israel is so utterly dependent on the United States at this point that no group can attain any degree of credibility in Israel unless it has substantial American support. That's one of the reasons that people like Meir Hale and others like him are so upset by the monolithic and chauvinistic and rather hysterical tendencies in the Middle-United States on this issue. They know that unless some American support develops for a political settlement, then those groups within Israel, and they certainly exist, that regard QRNT developments as dangerous and intolerable, will have no domestic support. In fact, that's correct. Let's take a look at the current Knesset, the parliament. I'd suppose maybe 10% of its members would tend to support some sort of political settlement of the kind that corresponds to the international consensus. That's a rather optimistic appraisal. It may be much less than that. Explicitly committed to that are a smaller group. If American support, however, developed for a political settlement. 44. Chronicles of Dissent. Then such tendencies would develop in Israel in this direction too. DB, can you make some suggestions as to what people can do to become aware of this issue and effect some movement in the United States foreign policy vis-à-vis Israel? This is one of the easier questions. To change American policy with regard to, say, Central America would be extremely difficult because the United States has a long-time historic interest in violence and repression in Central America, and we're not going to give it up easily. But in the case of the Middle East, I think it would be quite an easy thing to do. Even though there's virtually no articulate voice in the United States in support of the international consensus on a political settlement, polls nevertheless indicate that a large percentage of the population, in many polls up to 2/3 or 3/4 of the population, support a Palestinian state. That is, they believe that the indigenous population should have the right of national self-determination alongside of Israel. That means that there's a potential popular support. Within elite planning groups, there's a real sharp division on this topic. There are people who feel that we should maintain Israel as a strategic asset and a base for projection of American power and a source of violence and threat to intimidate the region. There are many other people, including people who represent quite powerful economic and political interests in the United States, who believe to the contrary that we should go along with the international consensus and try to reach an authentic political settlement. George Ball is a good example of a spokesman for this point of view. A recent book of his, Error and Betrayal in Lebanon, which I am sure will never be reviewed here, is a good, clear, lucid and I think quite persuasive exposition of this point of view. This is not an Israel, the strategic asset. 45. Open political issue in the United States, and I think THLS is one of the rare cases where virtual domination, total domination of articulate expression of the media, the books, schools, the whole ideological system, the domination of that by one extremist position has in fact shifted the political balance very radically. The potential split among dominant American elites has even not emerged into policy, because the ones who support the hawkish, extremist, violent policy have almost total support in articulate opinion. That can be changed if people are willing to face the intimidation apparatus, which will be unpleasant. It's unpleasant to have mud thrown at you and be denounced, etc. But if you're willing to face that and to do some self-education, and the facts are available, and then some real education of others, organizing and so on, I think that political pressures can be developed to make it possible for congressional representatives and for the press. This means pressure on the press, too, to take a stance which at least recognizes reality, and also to effect political decisions and to move the United States towards joining what is a very broad international consensus on this issue. That could happen. It's easily within range. It would have large-scale support even among powerful American interests. In this respect, it's quite different, an easy task, than what faces people who are trying to change the American policy of organized violence in Central America. Terrorism. The Politics of Language. October 24, 1986. DB. To what extent does the control of language shape and form our perceptions and understanding of reality? There are obvious examples. One important fact to bear in mind when one listens to or is subjected to political discourse is that most terms are used in a kind of a technical meaning that's very much divorced from their actual meaning, sometimes even the opposite of it. For example, take a term like national interest. It is commonly used as if it's something good for us, and people are supposed to understand that. So if a political leader says that I'm doing this in the national interest, you're supposed to feel good because that's for you. However, if you look closely, it turns out that the national interest is not defined as what's in the interest of the entire population. It's what's in the interests of a small group of dominant elites who happen to be able to command the resources that enable them to control the state, basically corporeous-based elites. That's what's called the national interest. Correspondingly, the term special interests is used in a related way to refer to the general population. The population are called the special interests and the corporate elite are called the national interest. You're supposed to be in favor of the national interest and against the special interests. This became very clear in the last few presidential campaigns. The Reagan administration is largely a figment of public relations industry. The public relations 47, 48, Chronicles of Dissent. Aspects of it, including control over language, are very striking. It's a professional public relations outfit. It was interesting to see how the choice of terms they used was carefully crafted. In both the 1980 and 1984 elections, they identified the Democrats as the party of special interests. And that's supposed to be bad, because we're all against the special interests. But if you look closely and ask who were the special interests, they listed them: women, poor people, workers, young people, old people, ethnic minorities. In fact, the entire population. There was only one group that was not listed among the special interests: corporations. If you'll notice the campaign rhetoric, that was never a special interest. And that's right, because in the terms, that's the national interest. So if you THLNK it through, the population are the special interests and the corporations are the national interest. And since everyone's in favor of the national interest and against the special interests, you vote and support someone who's against the population and is working for the corporations. This is a typical case of the way the framework of thought is consciously manipulated by an effective choice and reshaping of terminology so as to make it difficult to understand what's happening in the world. A very important function of the ideological institutions, the media, the schools, and so on is to prevent people from perceiving reality, because if they perceived it they might not like it and might act to change it. That would harm privileged people who control these things. DB perhaps sits as George Orwell one note in his essay Politics and the English Language, that in our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of indefensible. Yes, he gave interesting examples which are now classic, like the term pacification. It is used for mass murder. Thus we carried out pacification in Vietnam. Terrorism, the politics of language. 49. You look at what the pacification programs were. They were literally programs of mass murder to try to suppress and destroy a resisting population. Orwell wrote long before Vietnam, but he already noted that pacification was being used that way. By now it's an industry. It's the same with every term you can think of. Take the term conservative. Consecutive is supposed to be a good thing, and this is supposed to be a conservative administration. A true conservative, like, say, Robert Daft, would turn over in his grave to see what's being called conservative. Everything the conservatives have always fought against is being advanced by this administration. It's in favor of extending the power of the state and increasing the intervention of the state in the economy. State power has increased faster under this administration than under any since the Second World War. It's also interested in protecting the state against its citizens, cutting down access to the state, controlling thought, controlling expression, attacking civil liberties, attacking individual rights. It's the most lawless administration we've ever had. All of these things are anathema to conservatives. Conservatives want the opposite in every respect. So naturally they call the administration conservative, and if you like it, you're supposed to be conservative. These are all ways of undermining the possibility of independent thought by eliminating even the tools that you can use to engage in it. DB, the power of numbing seems to be crucial in this whole process. These are all examples of it. Languages, after all, a tool for thought. If you debase the language, you debase the thought. I don't want to exaggerate this element of it, but it is one element, and one that's certainly consciously manipulated in order to introduce confusion and lack of. 50. Chronicles of Dissent. Perception. DB in recent years. Starting in the 1970s, continuing through the 1980s and the foreseeable future, the terrorism has become a dominant issue, a theme and focus for the media. And politicians, I wonder if we could talk about the word itself. It seems to have undergone a curious transformation in the last couple of centuries. It definitely has. It's a very interesting case. The word terrorism came into general use at the end of the 18th century, and it was then used to refer to acts of violent states that suppress their own populations by violence. Terror was the action of a state against its own citizens. That concept is of no use whatsoever to people in power. So, predictably, the term has come to be changed. Now it's the actions of citizens against states. In fact, the term terrorism is now almost entirely used for what you might call retail terrorism, the terrorism of small, marginal groups, and not the terrorism of powerful states. We have one exception to this. If our enemies are involved in terrorism, then you can talk about state terrorism. So there are really two things that define terrorism. First, it's done against states, not by states against their citizens, and it's done by them, not us. So, for example, take Libya. Gaddafi is certainly a terrorist. The latest edition of the Amnesty International publication, Political Killings by Governments, lists Gaddafi as a terrorist. He killed 14 people, Libyans, mostly in Libya, in the 1980s. There may be a handful of others, but even taking the most extreme estimate, it couldn't be more than several dozen, probably less. That's terrorism, and he's therefore the mad dog of the Middle East and the king of international terrorism. That's because he meets our criteria. He's them, not us, and the terrorism that one talks about is carried out generally by small groups, not by one of our major states. Terrorism, the politics of language. 51. Let's compare it with El Salvador, in the same years, in which Libya killed 14, maybe 20 people, mostly Libyans. The government of El Salvador slaughtered about 50,000 people. Now that's not just terrorism, that's international terrorism, because it was done by us. We instituted the government as much as the Russians instituted the government in Afghanistan. We created the army, a terrorist army. We supplied, organized and directed it. The worst atrocities were carried out by American-trained elite battalions, fresh from their training. The US Air Force participated directly in coordinating bombing strikes. The terror was not ordinary killing. Libyan terror is bad enough. They kill people, but are terrorists. First mutilate, torture, rape, cut them to pieces. It's hideous torture, Pol Pot style. That's not called terrorism. El Salvador is not called a terrorist state. Jose Napoleon Darty has presided over all this, who has perceived his role from the beginning as ensuring that the murderers are supplied with weapons, and that nothing will interfere with the massacre which he knew was coming when he joined the military junta. He's called a great liberal hero, and El Salvador is considered a kindi of magnificent triumph of democracy. Here's a major terrorist state. Libya is very, very minor terrorist state, but we see it there. Other way around it. Terrorism is used for them, not us. In the case of El Salvador, it's plainly being done by a major all state against its own citizens, in fact a state that we established, a client state of the United States. Therefore, it can't be terrorism. By definition, THLS is true in case after case. My book about it, Pirates and Emperors, takes its title from a rather nice story by St. Augustine in HLS City of God. St. Augustine describes a confrontation between King Alexander the Great and a pirate whom he caught. Alexander the Great asks the pirate, "How dare you molest the sea?" The pirate renes to Alexander the Great and says, "How dare you molest the whole world? I have a small boat, so I am called." 52. Chronicles of Dissent. A thief and a pirate. You have a navy, so you're called an emperor. Street. Augustine concludes that the pirate Sinswa was excellent. That's essentially the story. Retail terrorism directed against our interests is terrorism. Wholesale terrorism came out for our interests isn't terrorism. The same is true in the Middle East region. In case after case, this is the way the term is used, and very effectively. In fact, it was very predictable that the Reagan administration would take international terrorism to be the core of its foreign policy, as it announced right off. The reason was that the administration made it very clear that it was going to be engaged in international terrorism on a massive scale, and since it's going to be engaged in international terrorism, naturally, in a good public relations directed world, you start off by saying that you're opposed to international terrorism. That shifts attention away from the crucial issue that you're going to maximize international terrorism. DB, why the tremendous fascination with terrorism, the TV specials, the articles, the documentaries, the symposia, the conferences, and on is there something deeper that's being touched by this? Oh, yes, very deep. It's very close to the Reagan administration's domestic policies. It's important to remember that the Reagan administration's policies are extremely unpopular, and for obvious reasons. The polls show this very clearly. On just about every major or issue, the public is strongly opposed to the Reagan programs. Take, say, social spending versus military spending. When the question is asked in polls, would you prefer to have a decrease in welfare payments or in military spending? The overwhelming majority of the population supports social spending and opposes military spending. In fact, much of the population is quite willing to see taxes raised. Terrorism, the politics of language. 53. To improve social spending. The same is true on just about every issue. On intervention abroad. In other words, international terrorism. If we were to be honest, the population is strongly against it, by large majorities. The Reagan administration is for it. On the nuclear freeze, the public is overwhelmingly in favor of it. The figure is something like 3-1. The administration is against it. And so on. As you go down the line, every major all policy program is unpopular. This is a problem, of course. You've got to control the population. There is a classic answer to this problem. You frighten them. Let me, Jane, you go back to another step of the Reagan program, which is even more obvious. An essential part of the Reagan program was to try to transfer resources from the poor to the rich. Now, that's going to be unpopular, and the attack on social spending is a part of it. Much of the Reagan program is turning an increasingly powerful state into a welfare state for the rich. The military program is very largely for that purpose. That's a forced public subsidy to advance industry. Again, unpopular, and you can't present it in these terms. What do? You have to get the public lined up. They oppose your policies. There's only one way to deal with this. Every leader throughout history has understood it. You've got to frighten them, make them think their lives are at stake, that they've got to defend themselves, and then they'll accept these programs that they despise or dislike as an unfortunate necessity. How do you terrify people? Again, there's a classic answer. You find some evil empire that's threatening to destroy them. In our case, it's now the Soviet Union. It used to be the Huns, before that, the British, and so on. But since the Bolshevik Revolution, it's been the Soviet Union that's threatening to destroy us. So that's the evil empire. But here you run into a problem. Confrontations with the evil empire are dangerous. That's a big, powerful state. It can fight back, and you don't want to get involved. 54. Chronicles of Dissent. With them, because you might get hurt. So what you have to do is have confrontations, but not with the evil empire. That's too dangerous. The best way is to have confrontations with groups that you designate as proxies of the evil empire. What you try to do is to find essentially defenseless countries or groups that can be attacked at will, and designate them to be proxies of the evil empire, and then you can defend yourself against them by attacking them. Libya, for example, is perfect for this purpose. It has loose associations with the Soviet Union. It's a minor actor in the world of international terrorism, against the background of anti-Arab racism, which is rampant in the United States. It's the last legitimate form of racism. You can easily talk about the mad dog and how he ought to get down from the trees and all this kind of stuff. That works. That scares people. Furthermore, if you can manage to elicit terrorism, which some of our acts have done, that will really frighten people, since that strikes at home. In fact, actual terrorism is very slight. You're much more likely to be hit by lightning. But people can get scared, and a confrontation with Libya is cheap. You can kill Libyans at will. They can't fight back. It's a tiny, defenseless country. We can beat them up every time we feel like it. It will make people here feel that somehow our courageous cowboy leader is defending us from these monsters who are going to destroy us, most of which is a public relations concoction. In fact, throughout the history of the Reagan administration, there has been a sequence of carefully concocted, fraudulent incidents created to give us an opportunity to attack and kill Libyans, always for some specific political purpose at home, like building up support for the Rapid Deployment Force, an intervention force in the Middle East, or gaining support for country aid, or one thing or another. They're very carefully timed. As I said, this is a public relations administration. Their genius is manipulation of the public. That's what they're good at. The spring of 1986. Terrorism, the politics of language. 55, for example, was a brilliant exercise in public relations. DB, the bombing of Libya, and the impact. The pretext for it was fabricated. It was covered up by the media, which know the true story but will not report it. It terrified the domestic population. People wouldn't even go to Europe. They were so scared, which is ludicrous. You're 100 times as safe in any European city as in any American city, but people were so terrified they stayed at home. If you can terrify the domestic population, then they'll support things like Star Wars or whatever lunacy comes along in the belief that you have to defend yourself. Crucially, you can't have confrontations with the Russians. They can fight back. So you've got to find somebody you can beat up at will. Grenada, Libya, Nicaragua, anybody who can't fight back. That's what you need. This is, incidentally, understood very well abroad. When you read the foreign press, they regularly comment on the thuggishness and the cowardice of this administration, the sort of bully on the block mentality. You find somebody little enough to beat up, and you go send your goon squads to beat him up. That's essentially their style. But here, somehow people can't see it. DB, this retail minor actor terrorism you've been talking about when it has presented in the media it occurs historically. It has no context. It is totally irrational, so it seems that the logical response would be one of loathing and fear, and it's very effective. That's right. Most of the retail terrorism, what is called terrorism in the United States, comes out of Lebanon, and that started in 1982. It was a very marginal phenomenon before that, a major phenomenon, mainly in Europe, after 1982, so plainly something must have happened in 1982 to cause terrorism to start conjuring out of Lebanon during that year with enthusiastic American 56. Chronicles of Dissent. Support. Israel attacked Lebanon. The purpose of the Israeli attack was to demolish the civilian society of the Palestinians so as to ensure Israeli control over the West Bank, and in the process the Palestinian community was destroyed, and Lebanon, already in bad shape, got the final blow. The United States supported it all the way. We vetoed UN resolutions trying to stop the aggression. We supplied Israel with arms, diplomatic support, the whole business. And naturally, it was perfectly predictable that that was going to evoke international terrorism. You cut off every political option for people and they are going to turn to terrorism. And I should say that this was well understood in Israel. Here you can't talk about it, because we are a much more indoctrinated country, but in Israel, which is a more democratic society, at least for the Jewish majority, this was openly discussed. For example, the current Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, pointed out that there was a threat to Israel from the Palestinians, but said it was a political, not a military threat. The threat was that they would compel Israel to enter into a political settlement that it didn't want, and that had to be stopped. Israel's and perhaps the world's leading specialist on the Palestinians, a professor at Hebrew University named Yehoshua Porat, wrote an analysis shortly after the invasion, a long, detailed article in Haaretz, Israel's major newspaper, kind of like the New York Times, in which he explained what he thought, very plausibly, the invasion was about. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't Torah. Hey, here's the situation. For the last year, the PLO has not engaged in any cross-border terrorism. Israel has tried to get them to do it. We have continually bombed them and murdered them and so on to try to evoke some response across the border, but they haven't done it. They've kept discipline despite the fact that we bombed them, killing dozens of people and so forth. This is a veritable catastrophe for the Israeli leadership, since if PLO continues to maintain terrorism, the politics of language. 57. This posture of not engaging in cross-border terrorism and demanding a diplomatic settlement, Israel might be driven to a political settlement, which it does not work. In a political settlement, it would have to give up control of the occupied territories. What the Israeli leadership wants is to return the PLO to much earlier days when it engaged in random terrorism, a PLO that will hijack airplanes, kill many Jews and be a source of loathing and horror throughout the world. They don't want a peaceful PLO that refuses to respond to Israeli terrorist attacks and insists on negotiation. That's what the invasion will achieve. Others also commented in the same way, and that's a very plausible analysis. I presume that's what the planners in the Reagan administration wanted, too. From their point of view, terrorism coming out of Lebanon is very beneficial. It frightens the American population. Terrorist attacks are indeed loathsome, and if you cut people off from every possible option, you can predict pretty well that that's what they're going to do. So let's take, for example, the Karachi hijacking. It appears we don't know for sure as if the hijackers were victims of the Sabra Sheikla massacre. Everybody knows what it was. That's what happens. You send killers into a defenseless civilian area for the purpose of slaughtering and torturing people, and those who survive are very likely to turn to terrorism. And that's in effect what happened. People pretend they don't understand, but anyone who can look at dates can figure it out. The Lebanese-based terrorism, mainly in Europe, since 1982, is a direct predictable and probably desired effect of the U.S. backed Israeli against Zion in Lebanon, which eliminated the hope of a political settlement, demolished the civilian society and the PLO brutally, I should say, and smashed to pieces what was left of Lebanon. Every time we look at terrorism, there's a context, though virtually unreported here. There's an interesting reaction here when this is 58. Chronicles of Dissent. Brought up, you're justifying one-dorism. I'm not justifying terrorism. Justification and explanation are two different things. What you're pointing out is that there's an explanation for terrorism, and if you want to stop it, you look at the explanation. When you look at the explanation, you quite often find that violent, powerful states try to evoke terrorism because it's in their interest. That's no justification, it's an explanation. Terrorist acts are indeed loathsome. It was loathsome when Leon Klinghoffer was thrown off a boat in a wheelchair and killed on October 7, 1985. It was also loathsome when, a week earlier, Israeli bombed Tunis and killed about 75 people using smart bombs that the United States probably supplied them. That's loathsome too. We regard one, but not the other, as terrorism, because one was retail terrorism on their side and the other wholesale terrorism on our side. DB, that particular attack, the Tunis bombing, is, of course, always framed in the concept of retaliation. It was a response, not initiated. Every terrorist attack is always called retaliation. The sequence is as follows. First came a PLO attack in Lanka, Cyprus, where 3 Israelis were killed. The killers were immediately caught and placed on trial. They're now in jail. About a week later came the Israeli bombing of Tunis, in which, according to Israeli correspondents, about 75 people were killed, 20 Tunisians and 55 Palestinians, mostly civilians. Then, a week after that came the Achille Lauro hijacking with the Klinghoffer assassination. All 3 of these things were called retaliations by the people who did them. The Larnaca, Cyprus operation was called a retaliation for a fact which is suppressed here, namely that the Israeli Navy, apparently using agents based on Cyprus, has been hijacking boats for over 10 years. That's called terrorism, when the other guy does it hijacking boats in transit between Cyprus and various parts of terrorism, the politics of language. 59. Northern Lebanon. In fact, they have often taken Palestinians off those boats and handed them over to their own Maronite allies in Lebanon, who then killed them. The PLO claimed that Larnaca was in retaliation for the many years of hijacking, which certainly happened, there's no doubt. We didn't call that retaliation, we just called it terrorism. Then came the Israeli bombing, which they called retaliation, except with one slight problem. It was not directed against the people who carried out the terrorist attack. In fact, Israel had conceded that the people they were bombing in Tunis apparently had nothing to do with the Larnaca attack, but it was a cheap target. The people who had to do with the attack probably came from Syria, but that's not a cheap target. They can fight back. Tunis, on the other hand, is a defenseless target, so you attack it. That's the way it's done. It was done, incidentally, with the complicity of the United States. The US 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean certainly had the Israeli bombers under surveillance. They claimed they couldn't see them, which was ridiculous. The Israelis had to fly all the way across the Mediterranean. They were refueled in flight. They passed by the most sophisticated radar and surveillance systems that the US government and military can establish, and somehow we claimed that they were invisible. That's nonsensical. We obviously knew they were coming, and we didn't warn Tunis. Tunis is a loyal ally, but we didn't warn them that the killers were on the way. Anyhow, they called that a retaliation, but of course it wasn't. It had nothing to do with the attack. Then came the Achille Lauro hijacking. They called that a retaliation, namely for the Tunis bombing, and you can trace it back as far as you like. Go back to the first interaction, and every step is called by the terrorists a retaliation for what came before, and in a certain sense it is. That's the cycle: repression, violence, retaliation, more retaliation, preemption, etc. 60. Chronicles of Dissent. In our ideological system, we have a very simple way to handle it. When the guys we don't like do it, it's terror. When the guys we do like do it, it's retaliation. The propaganda system. October 24th, verse 986. DB, you've talked extensively about the politics of language semantics, and you've said we have to peel away veil after veil of distortion to see the truth. My question is, in the age of Orwell, and given the U.S. educational system, what intellectual tools is that system providing to students to decode, decipher and translate those Orwellian terms? L. Teton first comment that, although we always, I too, call this the age of Orwell, the fact is that Orwell was a latecomer on the scene. The American public relations industry, which is a very sophisticated industry, already in the early 1920s was developing these tools, writing about them, and so on. In fact, even earlier, during the First World War, American historians offered themselves to President Woodrow Wilson to carry out a task that they called historical engineering, meaning designing the facts of history so that they would serve state policy. That's Orwell, long before Orwell was writing. Shortly after that, American journalists like Walter Lippmann, the famous American journalist, said in 1921 that the art of democracy requires what he called manufacture of consent, what the public relations industry called engineering of consent, another Orwellism meaning thought control. The idea was that in a state in which the government can't control the people by force, it had better control what they think. So, well before Orwell, this was understood. The techniques were designed and had been implemented extensively. As to what the schools teach to defend people against this, the answer is simple. Oh, the schools are quite on the opposite side. They are part of the disinformation. 61. 62. Chronicles of Dissent. Apparatus. In fact, this is well understood, too. It's even well understood by liberal intellectuals, democratic theorists, and so on. We've discussed in another interview the example of the important study called Crisis of Democracy, another Orwellism meaning beginnings of democracy, published by the Trilateral Commission, a group international, essentially liberal elites. They are people of whom Carter was a kind of representative, along with the ones who staffed his administration. They refer to the schools as institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. Of course, they're talking to one another there. That's not what you say in public. But that's the way they're understood. They are institutions for indoctrination, for imposing obedience, for blocking the possibility of independent thought, and they play an institutional role in a system of control and coercion. Real schools ought to provide people with techniques of self-defense, but that would mean teaching the truth about the world and about the society, and schools couldn't survive very long if they did that. D.B. C.P. Otero, who has edited a collection of VR essays entitled Radical Priorities, has written in its preface, the totalitarian system of thought control is far less effective than the democratic one, since the official doctrine parroted by the intellectuals at the service of the state is readily identifiable as pure propaganda, and this helps free the mind. In contrast, he writes, the democratic system seeks to determine and limit the entire spectrum of thought by leaving the fundamental assumptions unexpressed. They are presupposed but not asserted. Semicolon. That's quite accurate. I've also written about that many times. Just think about it. Take, say, a country which is at the opposite end of the spectrum from us domestically, the Soviet Union. That's a country run by the bludgeon, essentially. It's a command state. The state controls, Everybody basically follows orders. It's more. The propaganda system. 63. Complicated than that, but essentially that's the way it works. There, it's very easy to determine what propaganda is. What the state produces is propaganda. That's the kind of thing that Orwell described in 1984. In a country like that, where there's a kind of ministry of truth, propaganda is very easily identifiable. Everybody knows what it is, and you can choose to repeat it if you like. But basically, it's not really trying to control your thought very much. It's giving you the party line. It's saying, here's the official doctrine. As long as you don't disobey, you won't get in trouble. What you think is not of great importance to anyone. If you get out of line, we'll do something to you because we have force. Democratic societies can't really work like that because the state can't control behavior by force. It can to some extent, but it's much more limited in its capacity to control by force. Therefore, it has to control what you think. And again, democratic theorists have understood this for 50 or 60 years and have been very articulate about it. If the voice of the people is heard, you'd better control what that voice says, meaning you have to control what they think. The method Otero mentions there is one of the major methods. One of the ways you control what people think is by creating the illusion that there's a debate going on, but making sure that that debate stays within very narrow margins. Mainly, you have to make sure that both sides in the debate accept certain assumptions, and those assumptions turn out to be the propaganda system. As long as everyone accepts the propaganda system, then you can have a debate. The Vietnam War is a classic example. In the major media, the New York Times or CBS or whatever, in fact, all across the spectrum except at the very far out periphery, which reaches almost no one in the major media, which reach the overwhelming majority of the population, there was a lively debate. It was between people called doves and people called hawks. The people called 64. Chronicles of Dissent. Hawks said, if keep at it can win. The people called doves said, even if we keep at it we probably can't win, and besides, it would probably be too costly for us, and besides maybe we're killing too many people, something like that. Both sides, the doves and the hawks, agreed on the something. We have a right to carry out aggression against South Vietnam. In fact, they didn't even admit that it was towering place. They called it the defense of South Vietnam, using defense for aggression in the standard Orwellian manner. We were in fact attacking South Vietnam, just as much as the Russians are attacking Afghanistan. Like them, we first established a government that invited us in, and until we found one we had to overturn government after government. Finally we got one that invited us in, after we'd been there for years, attacking the countryside and the population. That's aggression. Nobody thought that was wrong, or rather, anyone who thought that was wrong was not admitted to the discourse science. If you were a dove, you're in favour of aggression. If you were a hawk, you're in favour of aggression. The debate between the hawks and the doves, then, is purely tactical. Can we get away with it? Is it too bloody or too costly? All basically irrelevant. The real point is that aggression is wrong. When the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia, they got away with it. They didn't kill many PRP, but it was wrong because aggression is wrong. We all understand that, but we can't allow that understanding to be expressed when it relates to the violent actions of our state. Obviously, if this were a totalitarian state, the Ministry of Truth would simply have said, it's right for us to go into Vietnam, period. Don't argue with it. People would have known that's the propaganda system talking, and they could have thought what they wanted. They could have seen that we were attacking Vietnam just like we can see that the Russians are attacking Afghanistan. You couldn't permit that understanding of reality in the propaganda system. 65. This country, it's too dangerous. People are much more free. They can express themselves. They can do things. Therefore, it was necessary to try to control thought, to try to make it appear as if the only issue was a tactical one. Can we get away with it? There's no issue of right or wrong. That worked partially, but not entirely. Among the educated part of the population, it worked almost totally. There are good studies of this that show, with only the most marginal statistical error, that among the more educated parts of the population the government propaganda system was accepted unquestioningly. On the other hand, after a long period of popular spontaneous opposition, dissent and organization, the general population got out of control as recently as 1982. According to the latest polls I've seen, over 70% of the population still was saying that the war was, quoting the wording of the Gallup poll, fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. That is, the overwhelming majority of the population is neither hawks nor doves, but opposed to Barsamian. On the other hand, the educated part of the population, they're in line for them. It's just a tactical question of hawk versus dove. This is, incidentally, not untypical. Propaganda very often works better for the educated than it does for the uneducated. This is true on many issues. There are a lot of reasons for this. One being that the educated receive more of the propaganda because they read more. Another thing is that they are the agents of propaganda. After all, their job is that of commissars. They're supposed to be the agents of the propaganda system, so they believe it. It's very hard to say something unless you believe it. Other reasons are that, by and large, they are just part of the privileged elite, so they share their interests and perceptions, whereas the general population is more marginalized. It, by and large, doesn't participate in the democratic system, which is overwhelmingly an elite game. People learn from their own lives to be skeptical. 66. Chronicles of Dissent. And in fact, most of them are. There's a lot of skepticism and dissent and so on. Here's a case which is an interesting one because, while the technique of thought control worked very effectively, in fact to virtually 100% effectiveness among the educated part of the population, after many years of atrocities and massacres and hundreds of thousands of people killed and so on, it began to erode among the general population. There's even a name for that. It's called the Vietnam Syndrome, a grey disease. People understand too much. But it's very striking, very illuminating to see how well it worked among the educated. If you pick up a book on American history and look at the Vietnam War, there is no such event as the American attack against South Vietnam. It's as if in the Soviet Union, say, in the early part of the _1st century, nobody will have ever said there was a Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Everyone says it's a Russian defense of Afghanistan. That's not going to happen. In fact, people already talk about the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. Maybe they defend it, maybe not, but they admit that it exists. But in the United States, where the indoctrination system is vastly more effective, the educated part of the population can't even see that it exists. We cannot see that there was an American invasion of South Vietnam. It's out of history, down always memory hole. _no engineers this, who pulls this off, who are the mandarins, or to use Gramsci's term, the experts in legitimation. The experts in legitimation, the ones who labor to make what people in power do seem legitimate, are mainly the privileged educated elites, the journalists, the academics, the teachers, the public relations specialists. This whole category of people have a kind of an institutional task, and that is to create the system of belief which, the propaganda system, 67, will ensure the effective engineering of consent. And again, the more sophisticated of them say that, in the academic social sciences, for example, there's quite a tradition of explaining the necessity for the engineering of democratic consent. There are very few critics of this position. Among them is a well-known social scientist named Robert Dahl, who has pointed out, as is obviously true, that if you have a political system in which you plug in the options from privileged position, and that's democracy, it's indistinguishable from totalitarianism. It's very rare that people point that out. In the public relations industry, which is a major industry in the United States and has been for a long time, 60 years or more, this is very well understood. In fact, that's their purpose. That's one of the reasons this is such a heavily polled society, so that business can keep its finger on the popular pulse and recognize that if attitudes have to be changed, we'd better work on it. That's what public relations is for. Very conscious, very well understood. When you get to what these guys call the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the schools and the universities, at that point it becomes somewhat more subtle. By and large, in the schools and universities, people believe they're telling the truth. The way that works, with rare exceptions, is that you cannot make it through these institutions unless you've accepted the indoctrination. You're kind of weeded out along the way. Independent thinking is encouraged in the sciences, but discouraged in these areas. If people do it, they're weeded out as radical, or there's something wrong with them. It doesn't have to work 100%. In fact, it's even better for the system if there are no few exceptions here and there. It gives the illusion of debate or freedom, but overwhelmingly, it works. In the media, it's still more obvious. The media, after all, are corporations integrated into some of the major oil corporations in the country. The people who own land. 68. Chronicles of Dissent. Manage them belong to the same W elite of owners and managers who control the private economy and who control the state. So it's a very narrow nexus of corporate media and state managers and owners. They share the same exceptions, the same understanding, and so on. That's one major point. So, naturally, they're going to perceive issues, suppress, control, and shape in the interest of the groups that they represent, ultimately the interests of private ownership of the economy. That's where it's really based. Furthermore, the media also have a market. Advertisers, not the public. People have to buy newspapers, but the newspapers are designed to get the public to buy them so that they can raise their advertising rates. The newspapers are essentially being sold to advertisers via the public. Since the corporation is selling it and its market is businesses, that's another aspect in which the corporate system or the business system generally is going to be able to control the contents of the media. In other words, if by some unimaginable accident they began to get out of line, advertising would fall off, and that's a constraint. State power has the same effect. The media want to maintain their intimate relation to state power. They want to get leaks. They want to get invited to the press conferences. They want to rub shoulders with the Secretary of State, all that kind of business. To do that, you've got to play the game, and playing the game means telling their lies, serving as their disinformation apparatus. Quite apart from the fact that they're going to do it anyway out of their own interest and their own status in the society, there are these kinds of pressures that force them into it. It's a very narrow system of control, ultimately. Then comes the question of the individual journalist, the young kid who decides to become an honest journalist. Well, you try. Pretty soon you are informed by your editor that you're a little off base. You're a little too emotional. You're too involved in the story. You've got to. The propaganda system. 69. Be more objective. There's a whole pile of code words for this. And what those code words mean is get in line, buddy, or you're out. Get in line means follow the party line. One thing that happens then is that people drop out. But those who decide to conform usually just begin to believe what they're saying. In order to progress, you have to say certain things. What the copy editor wants. What the top editor is giving back to you. You can try saying it and not believing it, but that's not going to work. People just aren't that dishonest. You can't live with that. It's a very rare person who can do that. So you start saying it, and pretty soon you're believing it because you're saying it, and pretty soon you're inside the system. Furthermore, there are plenty of rewards if you stay inside. For people who play the game by the rules in a rich society like this, there are ample rewards. You're well off, you're privileged, you're rich, you have prestige, you have a share of power if you want. If you like this kind of stuff, you can go off and become the State Department spokesman on something or other. You're right near the center of at least privilege, sometimes power, in the richest, most powerful country in the world. You can go far, as long as you're very obedient and subservient and disciplined. So there are many factors, and people who are more independent are just going to drop off or be kicked out. In this case, there are very few exceptions. Let me just give you one example. In March 1986 came the major vote on country aid. For the 3 months prior to that, the administration was heating up the atmosphere to try to reverse the congressional restrictions on aid to the terrorist army that's attacking Nicaragua, what they internally call a proxy army. A proxy terrorist army attacking Nicaragua, which is of course what it is. DB, also called freedom fighters. To the public, they call them freedom fighters. If empty. Chronicles of Dissent. You look at the internal documents, they're a proxy army engaged in terrorism, but that's internal, so 111 call them by the accurate internal terms, proxy terrorist army. The question is, could we reverse the congressional restrictions on this? That was the government's problem. The first 3 months of that year were very interesting in that respect. How were the media going to respond to the government campaign to try to reverse the Congress' Senate vote on country aid? I was interested, so I took the 2 national newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and I went through all their opinion pieces, every column written by one of their own columnists, every author submitted opinion piece, and so on for January, February and March. There were 85. Of the 85, all were anti-Sandinista. On that issue, no discussion was even tolerable. So, 85 out of 85 followed the party line. Sandinistas are bad guys. Incidentally, it's interesting that there is one person of those 85 who has written elsewhere, in a more nuanced fashion, but not here. Perhaps he knows that he never could have gotten in unless he took that position. So on the major issue, are we against the Sandinistas? 100% control, not a whisper of debate. Now comes the next point. There are 2 very striking facts about the Sandinista government as compared with our allies in Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. These facts say i.e. undeniable, whatever you think about them. One is that the Sandinistas, among these Central American countries, are unique in that the government doesn't slaughter its population. That's just not open to discussion. That's a fact. Second, it's the only one of those countries in which the government has tried to direct services to the poor, has in fact diverted resources to social reform. Again, that's not under discussion. You can read that in the Inter-American Development Bank reports or anywhere you like. So these are 2 rather striking facts that differentiate Nicaragua from Guatemala. The propaganda system. 71. Mali, El Salvador and in fact even Honduras, where about half the population is starving to death. Those 3 countries, especially Guatemala and El Salvador, are among the world's worst terrorist states. In the 1980s, they have slaughtered maybe over 100,000 of their own citizens with ample U.S. support and great enthusiasm. They are simply violent, terrorist states. They don't do anything for their population except kill them. Honduras is more like a government where the rich rob the poor. They do some killing, but not on the scale of their major allies. Maybe half the population is starving. In contrast, the Sandinista government, whatever you think about them, has not slaughtered the population and has diverted resources to them. That's a big difference. So the next thing I looked at was, how often were those two facts mentioned in these 85 editorials? The fact that the Sandinistas are radically different from our allies in that they don't slaughter their population was not mentioned once. No reference to that fact. The fact that they have carried out social services for the poor was referred to in two phrases in 85 columns, both sort of buried. One was an oblique reference which said that because of the Contra war they can't do it anymore. It didn't say what they were doing. The other was a passionate attack against the Sandinistas as totalitarian monsters and so forth and so on, which said that, well, of course, they did divert resources to the poor. So, two phrases in 85 columns on that crucial issue. 0 phrases in 85 columns on the not insignificant fact that, as distinct from our allies, they haven't slaughtered their population. They haven't killed 100,000 people. Again, that's really remarkable discipline. After that, I went through all the editorials in the New York Times from 1980 to the present just editory ALS on El Salvador and Nicaragua, and it's essentially the same story. For example, in Nicaragua on October 15, 1985, the government instituted a state of siege. This is a 72. Chronicles of Dissent. Country under attack by the regional superpower, and they did what we did in the Second World War in Hawaii, institute a state of siege. Not too surprising. There was a huge uproar, editorials, denunciations. It shows that they're totalitarian Stalinist monsters, and so on. 2 days after that, on October 17th, El Salvador renewed its state of siege. This is a state of siege that had been instituted in March 1980 and has been renewed monthly since, and it's far more harsh than the Nicaraguan state of siege. It blocks freedom of expression, freedom of movement, virtually all civil rights. It's the framework for mass slaughter within which the army we organized has carried out massive torture, slaughter, and is still doing it. In fact, all you have to do is look at the latest Amnesty International report. So here, within 2 days, Nicaragua instituted a state of siege, and El Salvador renewed its state of siege under which they had carried out a major mass slaughter and torture campaign. The Nicaragua state of siege was a great atrocity. The El Salvador state of siege, which was far harsher in its measures and its application, literally was not mentioned. Furthermore, it has never been mentioned. There is not one word in about 180 editorials which mentions it, because that's our guys, so we can't talk about it. They're a budding democracy, so they can't be having a state of siege. In fact, the editorial comment and the news reporting on El Salvador is that this is somehow a moderate centrist government which is under attack by terrorists of the left and terrorists of the right. It's complete nonsense. Every human rights investigation, the church in El Salvador, even the government itself in its own secret documents, concedes that the terrorism is by the centrist government. They are the terrorists. The death squads are simply the security squads. Darty is a front for terrorists, as he knows. But you can't say that publicly because it gives the wrong age. You can go on and on, but these are very dramatic examples of utter civility. The propaganda system. 73. Of the media right at the top. They will not even permit opinion pieces, not only editorials. Even opinion pieces won't be permitted which stray from the party line, because it's just too dangerous. Similarly, throughout the whole Vietnam War, there was never an opinion piece in the New York Times or any other newspaper that I know of that said that the United States was wrong to attack South Vietnam. Here's a research project for someone. If you can find one word in any opinion piece in any American newspaper or in the media, I'd be very surprised. I haven't read everything, of course, but I've been following it pretty closely for years, and I've never seen it. DB is the control of capital, the source, the bedrock of power in the American state. Certainly, there's no doubt of it. The first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the President of the Constitutional Convention, John Jay, expressed it very accurately. He said, the people who own the country ought to govern it. And that's the way it works. There are all sorts of mechanisms. For one thing, they have the resources to participate in politics. They can get information, they can put pressure, they can lobby, they can build platforms. They, in fact, are the real market for the political parties. They allow the parties to survive. They staff the executive, by and large. They staff Congress even. Furthermore, if any government ever got out of line, even in the slightest way, they could stop it simply by cutting back investment, by capital flight, and so on. Here this isn't a problem, because the corporations so totally own the government that it never gets out of line. But in other countries, especially third world countries, that problem sometimes arises, and then very quickly, if the government tries to carry out social reforms, it's stopped. Why? Just a little bit of capital flight is enough to do it. 74. Chronicles of Dissent. And it means the country grinds to a halt. So an effective control over the basic decisions in the society is in private hands, narrowly concentrated, that's going to control the state. Historical engineering. October 24th, verse 986. DB. The rewards for playing ball with the system in this society and this culture are very clear. The financial rewards are obvious. We've talked about the prestige and class rewards as well. What about the other side of the coin? That about the punishments? Societies differ. For example, in the Soviet Union, the punishments for honest dissidents are that you may very well end up in a psychiatric prison or in exile under ugly conditions. If you're a dissident in a typical American satellite like El Salvador, you're likely to find yourself in a ditch tortured after hideous mutilation. In the United States, those are not the punishments. Here again, we still have to make distinctions. If you're a black organizer in the ghetto, you can be assassinated by the National Police, like Cal Police, or at least with their complicity, as happened with Fred Hampton in Chicago in 1969, a straight Star Post-style assassination of a sleeping man, probably drugged, in a 4 a.m. attack by the police, coordinated with the FBI. In fact, the black movement was decimated by government terrorism. A lot of that's pretty well documented. If you're essentially defenseless, you can be subjected to a fair amount of violence. Nothing like El Salvador, of course, but not so trivial either. DB. Or there's the example in your hometown of Philadelphia, Pfeffer's domestic air raid in American history. Yes, that's another one. It can happen, but it's not on the scale of a state that really terrorizes its own citizens. If you come from the more privileged classes, if you're a white middle-class person, then the chances that you are 75. 76. Chronicles of Dissent. Going to be subjected to literal state terror are very slight. It could happen, but it's slight. What will happen is that you will even be marginalized, excluded. Instead of becoming part of the privileged elite, you'll be driving a taxi cab. It's not torture, but very few people are going to select that option if they have a choice. And the ones who do select it will never be heard from again. Therefore, they are not part of the indoctrination system. They don't make it. It could be worse, but it's enough to discipline people. DB. Generally speaking, your books are ignored. They're not reviewed. You're really not invited on Face the Nation or the Evening News with Dan Rather, nor are you interviewed on National Public Radio. The few times that your books are reviewed, they are neither favorable or accurate. An example here, one is a New York Times review of Turning the Tide written by Alan Tone's son, who is the associate editor of Foreign Policy magazine. He began the review by calling you a new left stalwart, and then he says that the evidence that you present in your book is a clip job drawn from secondary sources, source histories, from news articles and reports from the usual assortment of liberal and left-leaning Latin American human rights group. Is that typical? It's surprising it was reviewed at all, but that's a typical sort of put-down. All you have to do is to look at the footnotes to see how false it is. First of all, the left-leaning human rights group Summit adopt the standard human rights group. There's nothing left-leaning about America's watch. From his point of view, they are left-leaning because they criticize Western as well as Eastern atrocities. And that, of course, is left-leaning. As for it being a clip job, like every scholarly work, I deal with original source, which are press reports of ongoing events. Exactly the same is true in the most honoured bits of scholarship. Furthermore, there is plenty of use made of unused primary sources, suppressed primary sources. For example, historical engineering. 77. Government documents that would never be used in the mainstream because they tell the wrong story. It's not because it's me. Any critic of party line must meet very high standards. If you're following the party line, you don't have to document anything. You can say anything you feel like. There are major books, well-reviewed, highly regarded, which are just an expression of opinion. There is nothing in them that you can even trace to its source, but that doesn't matter as long as you're producing the party line. That's one of the privileges you get for obedience. On the other hand, if you're critical of received opinion, you have to document every phrase. He also later in the review calls my writing turgid. That's correct. Part of the reason it's turgid is because every 3 words I have to have a footnote with big documentation explaining it. On the other hand, if you're on the other side, you can just pay attention to style, because it doesn't matter what you say. I should say, incidentally, that I benefit from that privilege, too. So that when I write critically of the Soviet Union, I don't have to document anything. Nobody ever cares. They think it's fine. Since you're attacking the enemy, why do you have to document anything? And if you're always within the party line, you never have to document anything. But the main point of interest about the review is his total incapacity to perceive the words. In fact, if you read through the review, he never takes issue with anything I say. This looks correct, and so on. But he says I'm missing the point because I don't explain how the United States should defend the national interest. He says something like, since he doesn't offer an alternative to defending the national interest, there's something missing the point. In fact, I discussed that matter at great length. I pointed out that the phrase national interest is nowhere used to refer to the interests of corporate elites. If I had more space there, I'd give a lot of documentation. 78. Chronicles of Dissent. Of it. And I said that of course, in that sense of national interest, the citizens of the country shouldn't want to defend it. It's often opposed to their interests. But he cannot understand that. A deeply indoctrinated person. A real sign of deep indoctrination is that you can't understand elementary thoughts that any 10-year-old can understand. That's real indoctrination. So for him it's kind of like a theological truth. A truth of received religion, that the national interest is what we should defend. Suppose I say everyone like you is using the term national interest in a very deceitful way. It's not in the interest of the nation. It's the interest of a powerful privileged group. Maybe this is the right way to defend their interests, but I'm not interested in defending their interests. I'm interested in defending the interests of the population of the United States, in fact the world. So I don't have to answer to your question. I don't have to provide a better way to serve the interests of the corporate elite. I'm just not interested in that question. He cannot understand that. It's not that he has an answer. He cannot understand the point. It's too far out of the way of thinking. In this respect, there's been a very sharp decline since the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, when you read Thomas Aquinas, he felt that he had to deal with heresy. He wanted to defend the doctrines of the faith against heresy, but he felt he had to understand it. Medieval theology had some aspects of an honest intellectual atmosphere. If people had heretical arguments, you had to pay attention to them, think about them, find answers to them. We've degenerated far below that in modern culture. Here you don't have to understand heresy, you just point to it. You just say, look, this guy's involved in heresy, and that's the end of that discussion. Now we go on. That wouldn't have been tolerated in more honest and intellectually advanced societies such as medieval theology. And this is another sign of the dramatic decline of the intellect. Historical engineering. 79. Gentian as they become the commissars for external power, state or private. The Review is a fine example of it. DB. Another example was Michael Mandelbaum's 1982 New York Times review of the Outlook Towards a New Cold War. This book is one of the most heavily and carefully documented books I've ever read. Mandelbaum really doesn't deal with any the substantive issues you raise, but he accuses you by saying if the book has a consistent theme at all, it's one of danger. So you're an angry person, and we know how to deal with angry people. Just dismiss them. That, incidentally, is true. I don't pretend not to be angry. When I am talking about torture, mass murder and slaughter and so on, I am angry. If I have to